right, thank you very much. And this is my first time in Estonia, so thank you very much to the Latitude59 folks. It's been a phenomenal experience. Show of hands, is this anyone else's first time? All right, just you and me. All right, there you go, great. Awesome. So my name's Patrick Fitzgerald. I'm a partner at Mach49, where we help companies refine, refresh, sometimes start from scratch their corporate venture capital arms. I also teach an entrepreneurship class at the Wharton School of Business in the US and help to launch startups out of there. Obviously, I have a phenomenal panel, but let's start with Carolin and give us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, it's great to be here, great to be back in Estonia. I'm Carolin, I'm a partner at Plug and Play. I lead all of our investments in EMEA and also support our corporates in setting up their CVCs. I actually started my career in CVC 8 years ago, worked for Next47, and then joined more the direct investment side, but super excited to talk about this topic today, how the perception changed, how more and more companies want corporate VCs on their cap tables, and yeah, very excited about the conversations today.
Nikola?
Yeah, it's my third time in Estonia altogether, so happy to be here. Always super exciting, obviously, for tech and IT. It's one of the most exciting places in the world and very admirable. I'm a director of startups at Infobip, which is probably the biggest tech company you never heard of. And you use our products every day in any kind of communication solutions. But in terms of background, I come actually from public sector a long time ago. Via the UN into the private sector, via corporates in Japan of all places, where corporate innovation is something they're struggling quite a lot. So happy to cover all these topics.
Excellent. So what is CVC? This was a term that I did not know anything about 5-10 years ago. Now in the US, corporate venture capital accounts for roughly 25% of all venture capital investments in the US. So it is a massively growing field, but what is it in fact? It is basically when companies or corporations, honestly, of any size, but oftentimes larger companies as they're growing, when they set up a separate venture fund outside of their core, right? So they have a core day-to-day business that they have to do, but somewhere along the line, someone approaches the CEO and the board and says, we need to get introductions to new tech. We need a new pipeline for M&A. We just need to be out there on the edge. How do we do that? Well, maybe we could do internal incubations and find new products and services doing that way, or we can directly invest in startups. And there are typically two ways of doing that. The first way is where you hire an outside firm and the corporation gives a pool of money to that firm and says, go ahead, have fun, invest, see what you can find for us on our behalf, but we're going to kind of keep it over here. The second way, which is what my firm does, is you bring in a company to teach people how to fish, right? Teach them the language of VC, make sure there's an understanding so that over the course of 2 or 3 years, that corporate venture fund operates on its own internally as a part of the corporation. So my first company that I started thousands of years ago, I didn't know this, but we took money from a corporate venture capital firm. And there are a lot of risks, but a ton of benefits if you take money from a corporate venture capital firm. Obviously, we know about angel investors and VC, and the prior room was maybe a bit more filled because it sounds sexier. But when you can do it right, corporate venture capital can be amazing. It can help your company grow. It can help your company get closer with its customers, but it also has phenomenal risks that sometimes if it doesn't go well, there's a big problem. So, Carolin, I'd love to hear your experience of CVC, maybe some highlights before we get into some potential lowlights.
No, for sure. I mean, we have the saying, in a recession, innovation counts double for a company, and then for CVC triple. So what do we mean by that? I think as a company, if you work with startups, you become more innovative as a big corporation. Then, of course, also you boost up your internal processes, so you save money, you increase revenues. And then I think the third element, if you also invest in that startup, you also create some financial incentives. So I think if a CVC actually invests in a company, there is a lot of mutual benefit of growing, and that's actually what it's all about. So my personal experience has always been very, very positive if the CVC is set up in a proper way. So if you have a good connection to the business units, if you have a team that's also incentivized on performance and not just strategically, And then I think you can do big things. So one great example from our portfolio is, for instance, Nairis, an image recognition solution. They got an investment by IKEA, and that led to a global rollout. So literally for them, their revenues grew a lot, but also the experiences with that. And I think that's a very great, example how getting this investment in from a corporate VC doesn't only give you money, but actually a lot of access to knowledge, to, of course, a new client, and also to a strong USP because you have the direct feedback. And this is why I'm a big advocate for our portfolio to work with corporates, but also for our corporates that it's actually a really good time to start a CVC right now because the market is not so competitive anymore. Founders are actually looking for different funding opportunities. And this is why I think it's really great that we're having this panel today and bringing more awareness to the topic.
Yeah, like we're saying, there's more options than just traditional VC. So this is obviously, I don't know if it's third or first. It depends on where you are as a startup. Nikola, think about any positive experiences you've had so far with CVC.
We work with a lot of big clients globally. A lot of global companies, the retail, e-commerce, the ones that I can talk about. From Burger King to Coca-Cola to Disney to Unilever, all the way to the tech giants like Uber and Bolt, etc. Rappi is one of the examples that we talked about before. So what we realized actually with these big companies working with startups, either way, investing or not, like CVC is obviously very beneficial. I would say younger big tech companies are more skilled in that. We consider ourselves to be one of those. Although at 4,000 people, it's becoming kind of hard. But we're much taking actually the advantage of investing in startups. And we invested in a couple of startups off our balance sheet, so not really in a CVC vehicle per se. And it's super beneficial for us. They're different industries, some of them very infrastructural, some of them more related to entering new markets. And actually, but then us as someone who invested in such startups, what we can do, we give them access to all these other customers and markets that we're in. And we are now in about 77 or 78 offices around the world. So if you're one of the startups that work with us and actually want to go to Latin America or Southeast Asia or any other place or West Africa, we are the place where we can actually enable this one way or the other. It doesn't work that seamless as we're saying right now. In theory, it's very beneficial. But like with VCs, I think it's to Carolin's point, that it has to be structured really well. And I think if you set it up properly and that the partners are correct, it's like picking a good CVC is actually you have to consider the same as picking a good VC. There's also a lot of bad VCs that
same rules.
Yeah.
So the biggest question you should ask as a startup is why does that corporate have a CVC? If you don't know that answer, that's where it gets kind of murky. So in the event that you know what a VC does, you know why they're investing, I would ask, why does Infobit need to do this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, just you see, I don't know the answer. No, but we're already at this stage. One of the reasons is actually for us, we realized that we're working with a little bit of context and background. We've always been enterprise first and B2B, so working with big companies in terms of product, in terms of services and so on. We realized actually the real opportunity for us in the market exists working with companies. The very good example is the Estonian company Bolt, which I'm sure you all know and you used this morning to come here, either on a scooter.
You wish you would have invested in that.
Yeah, no, but we worked with them very early on as a very early company, providing communication solutions for the app and for Bolt. But then having a CVC gives us access, because especially we're very industry agnostic, it gives us access to all these startups very early on. And one of the ways that we invest, actually, we supercharge startups with our products, and that really helps them early on.
So you invest plus the product.
Yeah, we are not the cheapest solution out there, to be perfectly honest, if you go these omni-channel things. But if you're at the early stage, if you're in the right stage of the startup, if you can really use our products at this early stage, we can help a lot. And this is when a good match happens. I'm sure it happens with you guys a lot as well. It really depends on the industry as well, I have to say.
Carolin, when you're Plug and Play is a traditional venture firm with a lot of different angles to it, but when you're looking at a company that is considering a CVC investment, what are some of the challenges or things you ask them to watch out for?
Yeah, I guess one is definitely voting rights. So what's actually the end goal of this corporation? Do they want to acquire the company at some point? I think we really like to have corporate VCs on the cap table. And I mean, we also do work with a lot of corporate VCs and support them in their investments. But I think one thing you always have to think about is ownership versus voting rights versus really exclusivity clauses. So that's something that we look at very carefully. And I mean, generally as a founder, you will never want an investor that wants you to be exclusive, because then in the end it will hinder your growth. And I think as a CVC, as you set up your strategy, of course there should be the strategic angle, working with the company, supporting them. There should also be a financial angle, but it shouldn't be just a vehicle to say, oh, I'm going to secure the solution for myself. I'm going to be the only competitor in the space using it, and then I'm just going to acquire the company, because then I think there's other ways to do that. So I think that's one thing that we try to make sure of, and also if we advise our CVC clients, we really try to help them to, in their strategy, define how do we really get this, synergies between both parties, how do we help the startup to grow without hindering them in their growth. And I think if there's unexperienced CVCs, so they don't have a structured vehicle, I think for you guys, I mean, you also, were a startup at some point and grew very quickly. But if you're a very strategic, investor, sometimes you might not really, think about this broader vision. How can this company still grow? And you might just think, what's the benefit for me? Right. And I think this is where you always, as a startup, really have to do your due diligence, ask what's your long-term vision? How can you help us grow as a company as well? And every time they mention exclusivity or these kind of things, I would be wary as a founder.
That's a great point. Read the fine print, read the details. So there is obviously a big culture shift. Sometimes when you have a 10-person startup that is now working with a global company with thousands of employees, and maybe that deal was struck with a small CVC team, so it felt very collegial and friendly, but now that startup is expecting a partnership with a global company with millions or thousands of employees. So the challenge of navigating that can be very hard, because you think, hey, I got this investment. That means now that they're going to be a customer of ours. In your experience, Nikola, have you seen that where it hasn't worked out?
Well, yeah, yes, more than no. It's just for context as well, and my background as well, living and working in Japan, I used to work with a lot of big Japanese companies that are trying, they're very, I would say, heavy and generous on capital, so which is good for a company to be. But then at one point, we would do the Silicon Valley tourism as well, visiting and then talk to them and say like, oh, okay, now working with innovation, what do you guys want to do? You want to do open innovation? You want to do, entrepreneurs in residence? You want to do contribute as an LP, or do you want to do an accelerator or CVC? And usually these big companies, the answer would be yes. We want all of that, and it's not you technically can't do that, and it's hard. But then to your point, you have to be very, very careful. Like for startups, it's shocking to engage with a company like this. It's very hard, and it's the culture clash is too big. It's just it doesn't work very often. So to both of your points, it has to be very, very strategic. It has to be very, very thought through. You have to do, as a startup, a due diligence of the CVC, how it's structured, how it works with sometimes the CVC has a direct link to the CEO, or to the board. Right. And they're complete autonomy. And their case is really, really good, and they build their own thing on the side, and that's great. And then maybe they just plug into whatever the corporate or one of the departments is doing. But sometimes, exactly to your point, Patrick, is like, it's super hard. And you learn to navigate this, and now you have to use your investor or the company and deal with their team in Latin America, and then you realize it's like some completely detached department. They don't know what you guys do, the language, the culture. It's a lot of rough seas along the way there. Yeah.
And for me, the ones that I've seen do it really well is they have a small deal team that goes out and finds the potential investments, negotiates the terms, and obviously makes the investment. But they also have another team who's responsible for pulling that small startup through the entire organization, to some degree holding their hand as they have experienced this culture shock. But now they have this massive new customer who's also an investor. In the IKEA example, is that how they set it up? How did that become, to some degree, successful? I know there's more to come with that story, but.
So I feel what's the core, like for us there's always two things. So you need to have the business units that would be using this involved early on. So you need to find the customer in the organization, and you always need to set KPIs. So in that example, they started with a pilot that had very clear KPIs. And they said, okay, let's start with one region, let's do an A/B testing, and let's see if our customers actually use this. So in their case, it's an image recognition solution. I maybe find an inspiring article on Pinterest. I want to see if IKEA has something similar, so I would use it. So for them, it was very easy to say, okay, do people actually use this feature, and then what's my conversion uptake through that? Numbers look good. They tried it in more countries, and then they rolled it out. So I think it always has to be this gradual process, and as a founder, you can never expect, oh, now they're my investor, this is going to be a global rollout, because obviously you first have to prove that this actually works. And so I think coming back to the initial point, business unit involvement early on and setting clear KPIs is core.
Yeah, I like the business unit having at least some understanding or buy-in. The worst example is you introduce the startup to the business unit, and the business unit says, I have no interest in this. Why did you invest in this? This makes no sense.
That's maybe better sometimes.
A little bit, right. So for the corporates, it makes a lot of sense, right? Setting up a CVC, there's a lot of advantages to it. Is there a little bit of downside because maybe you move too fast? Sure, but if they still have their core business, there's not necessarily that big of a risk or a fear. But moving to a question from the audience for you, Nikola, how do you overcome the startup's fear of the corporate actually limiting their full growth potential?
Yeah, very good question as well. I think, and something we discussed before as well, CVCs have a big problem with branding and imagery, right? I'm sure there are startup founders here, and I'm sure they are. And if I ask you if you want to raise from a VC or CVC, your instinctive response would be a VC, or maybe not raise at all. Ideally, that would be your ideal answer. But like the CVC has this problem when they need to become sexier in a way. You know, they need to. You said there's a lot of good examples. There's especially depending on the industry. If you're like some, let's say, energy or mining or some capital-intensive industry, it's actually better in many cases. Sure. But we don't know about that because it's a very closed, not closed, but kind of specific industry. But the CVCs and the corporate innovation world overall has to become really sexy in a way where you want to be desirable to startups. And then the startups would overcome that fear in a way where they see that you can actually deliver in a very, I can't believe I'm going to use this word, streamlined way, results for the startup. Whether is it in business or actual support of any kind, like a good VC would do as well. There is a reason, I think, and this is something I was thinking about, why a lot of CVCs rebrand themselves at some point or spin out, and because they want to seem sexier, in my opinion, or better to startups than what they are. Right. I don't know if that's the right approach. Maybe maybe you should be better at delivering who you are. Maybe they would be more honest in a way. But from Google Ventures and Microsoft Ventures and so on, they all try to, or SAP Ventures, Sapphire Ventures. They're kind of connected, and kind of everyone in the industry knows. But to the general public, they're not really a CVC. So, but the startups should definitely engage and overcome this fear. But again, to Carolin's point, it's exactly the same as a VC. Very strategic. You have to be very careful. You have to be aware of there's definitely going to be pros and cons. You really have to weigh that really carefully.
So there's a variety of industries where CVC makes specific sense. You mentioned energy and mining. You have these. Yeah. It's capital intensive. And to have a partner who has hundreds of years of experience can change the game for a startup and for the CVC. I used to be at the Bank of New York in the U.S., and certainly for finance, with all the regulations, all the lawyers you have to pay to create a startup in the U.S. at least, when we invested in a startup, oftentimes overnight that startup became a unicorn. So for example, there was a company called Fireblocks, and we made an investment in Fireblocks, and within a few months, it went from a $100 million valuation to $1 billion just because America's oldest bank made that investment, right? So it was life-changing for both companies. Are there industries, Caroline, that you can think of that make a good fit for CVC?
I mean, in the end, I think any industry that would, be interesting for startups to innovate in could be a good fit. I mean, for me, it's always like, why do we even differentiate between VC and CVC? In the end, it should just be a partner that comes on, that gives you money, but also more resources. And we always say it's kind of marrying someone, because if you're, for instance, a pre-seed seed founder, you're going to have these people involved probably for 8 to 10 years. So you need to make sure that, there's a value add. So I would say, obviously, industries like you mentioned that are very capital intensive, where you might also need maybe some hardware to it. It might be really good to get a CVC on early on. one example that I very often bring is, for instance, any kind of alternative proteins or innovation in the food space, because typically if you really want to scale that solution, you will need a lot of different assets, and as a startup it's just impossible to acquire these. So having a good strategic partner there that gives you their labs that you can use, that's I think very strategic. But I think generally there should be way more capital also coming from these corporates, and it shouldn't have this connotation of a CVC. It should just be really for you as a founder, what's the right fit, what's the value add, and if that value add is there, then I think it doesn't really matter who gives you the money, but it should be really
So would you advocate then for startups to, from the beginning, consider it alongside angel investors and grants and traditional VCs? Start from the beginning.
I mean, I guess in the very, very early rounds, obviously it will still be tough because you don't have any traction, and I don't see any very corporate company investing in something just that has a deck. But I think once you really start making revenues, you have good cases, then you also maybe see a little bit more which industries am I actually really performing well in, who are maybe already some of our clients, and go from there as well. But yeah, I think a lot of founders still have these fears that CVCs are very slow, that maybe they will only give them the money but then disappear. But I think all of the CVCs we work with, they're doing an incredible job. They're really bringing the companies a lot of business, a lot of introductions. And so I think this negative connotation just needs to change.
So Nikola, I know you're based in Tokyo, and the Japanese CVC market is pretty strong. It's relatively dominant, in my opinion.
Yes.
Are there regions you see growing and expanding in CVC that maybe we're not aware of?
Yeah, I think it's a good example. When Japanese CVC market is very strong and probably slow moving in a way. Yeah. Well, not so much, but then that's probably a topic for a whole new panel. But there's definitely regions again, there are good CVCs and bad CVCs, and good VCs and bad VCs, and they can either make a company or drive a company to the ground, in my opinion. Not always. Sometimes you just assist, but sometimes you actually can be so extreme. So you have to be very, very careful. Other regions for us, it's also connected to big industries, family offices as well, very relevant in some areas of the world, Latin America, Southeast Asia, where we notice. And then CVCs are actually sprouting more and more. And the ones, again, in my perspective, in my opinion, maybe that's because we are one of those, and we hope to be as good as a CVC or VC or whatever we raise soon, as those is actually younger companies, especially in tech. Younger companies that just launched, they usually went through this path in the last 10 years, right? In their own experience, and they started raising really, really successful investment vehicles. Doesn't have to be a CVC per se, but the way they engage and interact with startups, in my opinion, and what we notice with our partners, our clients, some of the biggest tech companies, whether it's regional Southeast Asia, Latin America, Europe, they are actually very, very good in engaging with startups one way or the other, and so much investing as well. Because again, they know the process, they've been there, they're still sexy compared to maybe some other companies. So we're definitely trying to be one of those. But I think older companies can actually make it and achieve that. It's very much so an image and branding problem that they can work on. Yeah. But and there's no reason for them not to be as interesting as VCs to some degree.
Excellent. So our goal here was to just educate you on the concept of CVC. Start now, start early. Potentially, be a little careful of the deal terms. Make sure it makes sense for you as a startup. If you're a corporate, think about the reasons why you're actually doing it instead of just, hey, I want to meet startups. What is the actual reason we're doing this? So we hope you found it helpful, informative. Thank you so much, Carolin and Nikola.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please, Herbert.
Thank you.